So today is Shushan Purim, the 15th of Adar, and in the city of Yerushalayim, they are observing Purim today. I guess by now they're probably basically done, but it's a very unique concept that there are different days for Purim for different places. We have almost a similar thing when it comes to Yom Tif, but it's very different in the diaspora outside of Israel. Each of the for most of the holidays, we keep 2 days, while in Israel they keep 1 day. But that is, something very specific that had to do with doubts about what was the proper day. That's why we end up keeping 2 days. This is very different here. And that's by the biblical holidays. This was a Purim was enacted by the men of the Great Assembly, by Mordechai and Esther, and it seems that originally, in the original enactment, they set it up that different places would celebrate it on different days. And the question is, why would they do that? And how do we delineate who keeps Purim on the 14th of Adar and who keeps Purim on the 15th of Adar? So our story really begins back in the Megillah, in the 9th chapter, where they are going to battle with their enemies, those who are attacking them amongst the Persians and others, and let's take a look in chapter 9 how things play out. So, so following the battle on the 13th of Adar, in chapter 9, verse 12, it says that the king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan the capital, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman, and the rest of the king's provinces, what have they done? And what is your petition? Etc. Verse 13, Pasuk Yagimel Vatomer Esther. And Esther said, Ima lamelech tov, if it's good for the king, yinasin gam machar laYudim asher b'Shushan. Let tomorrow also be given to the Jews in Shushan, lasos kedas hayom, to do as today's decree. Esther felt like there were additional enemies that still had to be uprooted in the city of Shushan specifically, it seems. And so she asks for another day to battle their enemies. And in verse 14, the king ordered that it be done. And in verse 15, Vayika'alu Yudim asher b'Shushan, gam b'yom arba asar l'chodesh Adar. The Jews in Shushan gather again on the 14th of Adar, Vayargu b'Shushan shlosh meos ish, and they killed 300 men on the 14th of Adar in Shushan. Ushar continues the verse 16, Tezayin, Ushar Yudim asher b'minos hamelech, and the rest of the Jews in all the other provinces of the king, Nikalu v'amod al nafsham, they assembled and protected themselves, V'noch me'oivehem, and they rested from their enemies, Varog b'sonehem, and killed those who hate them, 75,000. When was that? B'yom shlosha asar l'chodesh Adar. That was on the 13th. V'noach b'arba asar bo. And they rested on the 14th. V'aso yom mishteh v'simcha. And they made it into a day of feasting and joy. So this is going back. This is discussing the rest of the provinces. That they went to battle on the 13th of Adar, which was the day that Haman had chosen to attack the Jews. That's where the lots came out, the 13th of Adar. And on the 14th, they rested from their enemies, and they made that into a Yom Mishteh V'Simcha, a day of feasting and joy, the 14th of Adar. And that was yesterday. That's when we celebrated Purim, yesterday on the 14th of Adar. And then it continues, and I should just mention, up so far we haven't mentioned anything about a holiday being established. It just says they celebrated, they won the battle on the 13th, and so they celebrated and made the 14th into a day of feasting and joy. And then in verse 18, Pasuk Yudches, Vayodim asher b'Shushan yikalu b'shlosha asar bo, and those in Shushan, so they assembled on the 13th, Uvar Basarbo, and on the 14th. They assembled in battle, both the 13th and the 14th. because Esther had asked for that extra day. V'noach b'chamisha asar, and they rested on the 15th. V'aso yom mishteh v'simcha, and on the 15th they celebrated. That's when they rested from their enemies. They made that day a day of feasting and joy. Okay, therefore, says verse 19, Hayudima prazim hayoshvim b'area prazos. Therefore, the villagers who live in open towns, osim es yom arba asar l'chodesh adar, simcho mishteh v'yom tov, v'shoch manos ish l'reu. Therefore, those in the unwalled cities, the open cities, scattered cities, they celebrate, they make Purim on the 14th, and they have feasting and Yom Tov, and Mishalach Manos, sending portions to each other, each man to his friend. No mention, by the way, in that verse, and on the 15th, and those of Shushan do it on the 15th. It doesn't say that here for some reason. It said that those in the unwalled cities, it said that those in all the other countries, all the other provinces, they battled on the 13th, they rested on the 14th, and celebrated on the 14th. And those in Shushan battled on the 13th and the 14th, they rested on the 15th, and they celebrate on the 15th. And therefore, those in the unwalled cities, those in the open cities, make the 14th as a holiday. No mention of anybody making the 15th as a holiday. Okay. And Mordechai wrote these matters, and he sent letters to all the Jews. Verse 21, to establish for them, to enjoin them, that they should make the 14th and the 15th into holidays. So now the 15th is back. Now Mordechai is sending a message to make both the 14th and the 15th into holidays. As the days when they rested from their enemies, and the month that was reversed from them from grief to joy. So just like then, they rested and celebrated, so Mordechai established that they should continue to celebrate. And in verse 23, it says, the Jews took upon themselves what they had commenced to do, and what Mordechai had written to them. Why? Because Haman, the son of Hamdasa, the adversary of all the Jews, had devised to destroy them, and he cast lots to destroy them, etc. Skipping to verse 27, the Jews ordained and took upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all those who joined them, that is not to be revoked, to make these 2 days according to their script and according to their appointed time every year, they accepting upon themselves these 2 days of Purim. Okay, so we have that there was a difference between Shushan and the rest of the provinces. Shushan battled on the 13th and 14th and only rested on the 15th, celebrated on the 15th, and the rest of the provinces celebrated on the 14th, and Mordechai established these 2 days as days of Purim, days of celebration, days of, we don't have the verse here, but days of Matanos Lavyonim, of gifts to the poor, and Mishloach Manos. Okay, fine. So Shushan, we have Shushan and we have everybody else. That's what it would seem. If Shushan rested on the 15th, so they celebrate on the 15th, and everybody else celebrates on the 14th. So what does that have to do with Yerushalayim? Why are they celebrating in Yerushalayim today? Yerushalayim is not Shushan. Yerushalayim did not go to battle on the 14th and rest on the 15th. That was very specific to Shushan. So why is Yerushalayim celebrating Purim today on the 15th of Adar? So the Mishnah teaches us in the beginning of Maseches Megillah that it's not just Shushan that celebrates on the 15th. The Mishnah says, it's the second source, it's on page 2. Krachen hamukafen chomen mos Yehoshua ben Nun. Any cities that were surrounded by a wall since the days of Yehoshua ben Nun, since the days of Joshua, Korin b'chamisha asar. They read on the 15th also. It's not just Shushan. Any city that was surrounded by a wall since the days of Yehoshua ben Nun, when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel to conquer it, so they read on the 15th. Other ones, other cities, villages, and large towns read on the 14th. Basically, everybody else reads it on the 14th. So the Mishnah has expanded the number of places that celebrate on the 15th beyond just the city of Shushan to include any city that was walled since the days of Yehoshua ben Nun. Practically speaking, what cities are those? So the only city that we accept with certainty as being walled from the days of Yehoshua ben Nun is Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim definitively celebrates on the 15th. There are a number of other places that we consider Suffolk. They're in doubt. Some for different reasons. Some were in doubt if they had a wall. Some we know they had a wall. We're just not sure if the wall was the right kind of wall. Generally speaking, there's cities in Eretz Yisrael, but there are some cities that the poskim talk about, even outside of the land of Israel, that we also consider that were Suffolk if they're in doubt. Maybe they had a wall in the days of Yehoshua ben Nun, and those places, the places that are in doubt, I think the general custom is to primarily observe Purim on the 14th, but then on the 15th to redo everything in a minimal way. Hear the Megillah a second time on the 15th, give like one Mishalach Manos, give Matanos Lev. You don't go all out. I'm sure people are happy to go all out too, but it's not the recommended practice is just to just make sure you get the mitzvahs done a second time, just in case that's the proper day for them to observe Purim.
I think the actual city of Shushan is not inhabited now.
The actual city of Shushan, you're saying,
I
sorry, one
think
more
it's an
time?
archaeological site. I don't think
Right.
anybody lives there
Yeah.
now.
So practically they are not.
But if there were people living there, presumably they would also observe Shushan Purim.
Yes. Okay. So
Not a great place to be right now.
no. Okay. So a couple of primary questions we need to now understand. First of all, where does this come from? Why? We saw Shushan celebrates on the 15th, but where does it come from to expand it beyond just Shushan and to include any city that was walled from the days of Yehoshua ben Nun? Where does that come from? Why would we do that? Why in general would they establish 2 days? Okay, it's understandable that Shushan maybe should have a separate day, although that itself is questionable. Meaning even Shushan, they also went to battle on the 13th. And that was perhaps the main, even though the numbers, if you look at the numbers and the verses of people they killed, was less on the first day than the second day. First day it says 300, the second day it says 500, but still they could celebrate on the same day as everybody else. Why is it that there are two separate days of Purim? And secondly, if for some reason, whatever reason we say that we are going to expand it, we're going to expand it to any city that was walled. So why walled from the days of Yehoshua ben Nun? What does Yehoshua ben Nun have to do with anything? Yehoshua ben Nun lived, I guess like 900 years before this or so, 800 some odd years before the story of Purim. Doesn't seem to be very relevant. Why is it that the way it's enacted is not just Shushan, but any walled city? And how do we define a walled city? It's defined by whether it was walled in the days of Yehoshua ben Nun. Now, I should mention that it's actually a dispute in the Gemara and the Tosefta whether we do go back to the days of Yehoshua ben Nun. There are actually three opinions that are quoted in the Tosefta. And Tosefta is like teaching from the times of the Mishnah that was not included in the Mishnah, but it's like a brisa. It's something that was left out. But we have them. We have collections of them, and the Gemara will quote the Tosefta, and it does in this case. And the Tosefta has an opinion. The first opinion is our Mishnah, is what we just mentioned, that we go by if it was walled in the days of Yoshua ben Nun. There is a second opinion that it goes by whether it was walled at that time, in the times of Achashverosh. That any city that was walled in the times of Achashverosh will follow what Shushan did. And there's a third opinion, which is that it just has to do with if it's currently walled. Any walled city reads um, on the 15th, and any unwalled city does not. It doesn't really matter what it matters today. Is it walled or not? But again, we rule like the first opinion, so that's the one that we're going to be focusing on. So the Gemara brings what's called a Gezerah Shava. Gezerah Shava is a verbal comparison when you find one word and two words that are the same in two different places, and you have a tradition, then you can derive one from the other. And so the Gemara says as follows. Well, let's start with the Gemara that I put on the source sheet, and then there's a little bit more that I left off. So the Gemara asked this question. The Gemara says that the cities that were, like the Mishnah said, the cities that were surrounded by a wall since the days of Yoshua ben Nun, they read on the 15th. Ask the Gemara, Minahani Mili, from where is this derived? From where are these matters derived? So Amar Rava said, well, it says in the Megillah, Al King HaYudim HaPrazim HaYoshim Bari HaPrazos. It says that the Jews who are Prazim, what prazim means scattered. Scattered means they're uncontained. A wall, by definition, contains those who are living in it from expanding out, from spreading out. So prazim is usually an expression of an unwalled city. It's a sprawl. It just keeps going. It can at least keep going. It's not contained. It's not confined by any wall. So it says in the verse. We read this verse. This was verse um, 19, it said, therefore, the prazim, those in the scattered cities, the unwalled cities, in the open towns, read on the 14th. So the Gemara infers, mid prazim barbas, or if the open cities read on the 14th, so it sounds like the closed cities read on the 15th. Makes sense. So it's an inference from the verse in the Megillah. The Megillah says the open cities read on the 14th, implying that the closed cities, enclosed cities, walled cities, read on the 15th. The Gemara then asks, well, ve'ema prazim barba asar mukafin klal klalo. Well, maybe we have the wrong inference. Maybe the inference should be the the unwalled cities read on the 14th, and the walled cities don't read at all. Who says they read at all? Maybe the inference should be that they don't read at all. Says the Gemara, that can't be. You can't, that they shouldn't read the Megillah, that they shouldn't celebrate Purim. How could that be? Ask the Gemara, or rhetorically, the Gemara responds, V'lav Yisrael ninhu? Are they not Jews? Sounds like it's saying, were they not part of the salvation? Of course they have to be part of the celebration of Purim. Ve'od, and furthermore, it says in the Megillah, Mehodu v'ad Kush. It says that the kingdom of Achashverosh was from Hodu to Kush, meaning it was all over. It was the entire empire was his kingdom. I mean, that was his empire, but the entire inhabited world, perhaps. There's discussion. There may have been Jews in European countries that were outside of his empire, but for now we're going to assume it was the entire inhabited world. So, and it says Mehodu ve'ad Kush. It says from Hodu to Kush. So, and it says that Mordechai sent letters to all the countries. Right? We read that verse. The verse was verse 20. And Mordechai wrote these matters, Vayishlach tzevarim al kol hayudim asher b'chol minos melech Achashverosh. Hakrovim Harachokim. He sent letters to to the Jews that were in all the provinces, both near and far. So so all the Jews received this enactment. So it can't be that the walled cities were just left out of the enactment of Purim. Everybody was included. So so we have an inference that walled cities that unwalled cities read on the 14th, walled cities read on the 15th. Okay. Walled cities from when? How do we define a walled city? As we mentioned, there's perhaps three different ways to understand it. You could say maybe a walled city today. Maybe if it was walled in the times of Achashverosh. At that time, that would seem the most logical. But yet, there's the third opinion that it goes by if it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun. And and the question is why? So to this I left off the source sheet, but the Gemara continues, that same Gemara, and the Gemara says, I understand the opinion that it should be based on that time, if it was walled during that time. But where do we get that it should be based on if it was walled from the times of Yoshua ben Nun? So that's where the Gemara uses this Gezerah Shava. Gezerah Shava, again, is a verbal analogy. It's where you find the same word in two places and you compare them. And there has to be a tradition. And actually, there's something very unique about the book of Esther, about the Megillah of Esther, in the way that the sages relate to. I think I mentioned this last time or two times ago. That the last time that the sages relate to almost like the Torah itself and how they darshan, how they derive things from it. And the Yerushalmi, actually, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, goes into that directly, and kind of derives that you can derive from the Megillah. It makes it explicitly says that the Megillah is meant to be darshan, to be interpreted to similar to the Torah itself. So this type of Gezerah Shava, this type of verbal comparison is kind of, in general, we only find it in the Torah. We don't find it so much in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, and in the writings, but in the Megillah we do. So so we compare the word prazim here, prazim, which we said means unwalled cities, to a verse in the book of Devarim, where it also says prazim. The pasuk says, "Livad me'arei ha'prazi harbe me'od." So there, it's describing how the Jewish people are preparing to enter the land of Israel, and it's describing how they have very strong cities, besides for the many open cities that they have. That's the verse. They have very strong cities, the Canaanites, besides for the open cities that they have. So, well, and there we have. It's talking about as they're getting ready to enter the land of Israel. And it's describing the walled cities versus the open cities. And you have the word prazi describing the open cities. So we're going to borrow from there, from the book of Devarim, and say whatever was being described as an open city in the book of Devarim, that's what we mean by an open city in the book of Esther. And whatever was a walled city in the book of Devarim as they prepared to enter the land of Israel, that's a walled city in the book of Esther. That's where we can derive that it goes by the days of Yoshua ben Nun. Just like it says prazim here in the Megillah, and it says prazi in the book of Devarim, both describing unwalled cities, open cities. So we're going to use that definition. Whatever was defined as an unwalled city in the book of Devarim, that's going to be our definition from the Megillah, and whatever was a walled city is a walled city here too. In other words, we base our definition for walled and unwalled in the Megillah based on what was walled and unwalled as they entered the land of Israel in the times of Yoshua ben Nun. So that is the source for it. It's not really a reason. It still doesn't explain why we would base it on the times of Yoshua ben Nun. It's a textual source using the power or the method of drasha, of learning it out, but it still doesn't explain why that still needs to be explained. So there's a comment of the Yerushalmi, of the Jerusalem Talmud, and this I did put on the source sheet. And the Yerushalmi says, places walled from the days of Yeshua ben Nun, read on the 15th. Rabbi Simon b'shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Shimon, in the name of Yeshua ben Levi, says, Chilku kavod l'eretz Yisrael, shahaisa chareva b'osing hayamim, v'talo sami mos Yeshua ben Nun. They honored the land of Israel, which was desolate in those days, and attached it to the days of Yoshua ben Nun. They honored the land of Israel, which was desolate in those days. This is the Yerushalmi. A little bit vague, doesn't really fully explain what it's saying. And here we have the commentaries elaborate. So the Ran, I think, is the simplest. The Ran says that we mentioned that there's Shushan and then there's everybody else. There's Shushan and there's everybody else. Well, says the Ran, sorry, one second.
Question while you're looking, Rabbi.
Yeah.
The way it's translated, from the days of Yehoshua, do we understand that as before and during the days of Yehoshua and not after the days of Yehoshua?
Do you want to know if
Yeah, it's
a
translated.
city,
Yeah.
which time, if Yoshua built a wall around a city, or if they built one after his death? Is that your question?
Well, the question goes to the way the translation works is mimos, from the days. That means after Joshua died, or
No, during his life. It had to have been walled
died.
during his lifetime.
So if there was a wall before he got there and not a wall later on, so it's during his life and up to the time he died.
I would think so.
All right, thank you.
Can I ask a question too?
Yeah.
Aren't the Prizim one of the 7 tribes that we're supposed to destroy in Eretz Yisrael?
There is a tribe called the Prizim, and it may be that their name is rooted in the same shorish, the same root. But that's not what's being mentioned in either of these verses. Here it's just the word Prazim, or Prazi, which means unwalled cities.
But how do we know that? Like, couldn't it have meant a bunch of cities of these people?
I don't think so. It's a Hebrew root.
Okay.
So when Haman describes the Jewish people in the Megillah, he says they are Mifuraz or Mifarad being Amim. I think the Mifuraz, which is the same root. So yeah, I don't think anybody would understand it that way. That has to do with the Prezi. Okay, so the Ran just tries to make it very simple. He says that you have Shushan and you have everybody else. You have Shushan resting on the 15th, celebrating on the 15th. That's the day that they're resting from battle. So their Yom Tov is going to be on the 15th, and everybody else is going to be on the 14th. And then he says, V'hishvu kol ha'krachim ha'mukafim chol Shushan. And they equated all the lands that were surrounded by a wall to Shushan. They made every place that had a wall, they made it like Shushan. Now in brackets here it says not that Shushan itself had a wall, which I think was a question, if Shushan itself had a wall. Just checking my other text here if it says it. Oh, there's different versions. Some say that Shushan, they make it equal because Shushan had a wall. Let me check which one's correct. Yeah, I think it should say that because it had a wall. It makes more sense. In the version that I printed out, it says that it didn't have a wall. But in my Gemara version, it says it had a wall, which makes more sense that Shushan had a wall. So they didn't want to just have Shushan alone celebrating on the 15th. They wanted to make all the cities that had walls at that time celebrate on the 15th. Why? What's the purpose? So I think the Ran, his next words explain to me. The main miracle happened in Shushan, meaning the bulk of the miracle of Purim happened in the city of Shushan. That was the capital. That's where Achashverosh was. That's where Mordechai was. That's where Esther was. If Shushan was the only place celebrating on the 15th, then I mean, first of all, nobody nowadays would be celebrating on the 15th. Nobody would really remember the uniqueness of the city of Shushan, the role that the city of Shushan played in the miracle of Purim. We need other cities to celebrate on the same day of Shushan. That's where the main miracle happened. So they said, well, let's pick something that's special about Shushan. What's special about Shushan? It's walled. So they enacted that walled cities should celebrate on the 15th, just like Shushan, and everywhere else will celebrate on the 14th. Now, okay, so now we've expanded it, that it's not just, and I explained the verse, right? The verse said, the unwalled cities are on the 14th, the walled cities are on the 15th, which makes sense because Shushan was a walled city. All the walled cities should celebrate on the 15th. Okay, but why not base it on the days of Achashverosh? Why base it on the days of Yeshua ben Nun? So that's where this Yerushalmi comes in. Well, if you base it on the days of Achashverosh, it's not going to look good for the land of Israel because the land of Israel was just in the last 70 years was conquered by the Babylonians, torn apart. Walls were destroyed. Yerushalayim was destroyed, and there aren't really any or many walled cities in the land of Israel right now. All the cities that may have been previously walled are no longer walled at the time of Achashverosh, and it looks really bad for the land of Israel if we base the enactment on the times of Achashverosh. Then if you're walled in the days of Achashverosh, then you celebrate on the day that Shushan celebrates. But that's not going to include any cities in the land of Israel because nothing was walled at that time because Eretz Yisrael had been destroyed. So therefore, in order to kind of raise up the honor of the land of Israel and show that the land of Israel is a great place and had walled cities. There was a time where it had walled cities in the times of Yoshua ben Nun, really after also. So therefore, they backed it up. They backed it up earlier than the days of Achashverosh. They backed it up to the days of Yoshua ben Nun in order to, as the Yerushalmi says, to attach honor to the land of Israel.
Rabbi?
Now, you don't need to go all the way back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun to do that. You really could have just gone back maybe just before the Churban, before the destruction. Why go all the way back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun? So here there's a comment of Rabbi Ovadia Mibartanura, and he says, well, there's another connection here, which is that the victory of Purim was a victory over Amalek. And who started to really fight against Amalek? Well, it actually goes back to our times in the desert. The first time Amalek attacks us, so who is it that leads the battle against Amalek? It's Yoshua. Moshe sends Yoshua to lead us into battle against Amalek, or into defense against Amalek. So because Yoshua was the one who began the fight against Amalek, so therefore they saw fit to relate the celebration of Purim, at least of the walled cities, to Yehoshua. That's what the Bartanura writes, and I think he's coming to explain why didn't they just say it should be from the times of David or the times of King Shlomo or right before the destruction. If the concern is simply we can't base it on the days of Achashverosh because it's dishonorable to the land of Israel, so then which is now destroyed, so go back to right before it was destroyed. Why go back hundreds of years to the times of Yoshua? So Bartanura suggests they wanted to associate it with Yoshua, who began the fight against Amalek.
Question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if another source will get to this, but could it be that at the time of Purim, there was a desire to encourage resettlement of Eretz Israel, and they're drawing a parallel to Joshua's entry into Eretz Israel.
So it's interesting you say that. I didn't go through the source fully, but I saw someone quote a Ritva. Let me just see how it's quoted. Um, second. No, sorry. I saw cited from yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't nobody says it exactly like that, but it's I hear the suggestion. I think it makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. The last source I want to discuss is the Ramban. And the Ramban has a more elaborate explanation for what is going on here. And and he reads into the verses, and others debate him on it, but he has a much more elaborate explanation. The Ramban is bothered. Why are we making two different days of Purim? We we what encouraged them to do this? In general, we want achdus, we want unity. Why have two different days? We don't find this in any Torah mitzvah. What's going on here? So again, he says, well, we know that Shushan celebrated on a different day. Shushan resting on a different day, so that maybe they make it two separate days. But he's not so happy with that for the reason I mentioned before, because even in Shushan, the main miracle was that they were saved on the 13th. Esther asked for an extra day to fight their enemies. Doesn't seem that they were under great threat on the 14th and needed that extra day. It was obviously she had reasons to ask for it, but even Shushan, the main miracle was on the 13th, and they could have celebrated it on the 14th like everybody else. So the Ramban thinks there's something much bigger going on here, that they divided Purim into two different days. and and he says, and this is the Ran debates the Ramban on this point, but the Ramban says that at this point in time, many Jews had actually already returned to the land of Israel. We know actually that they had begun rebuilding the second temple. It was stopped, but they had begun rebuilding it. And even though he says, we know, as I mentioned before, Haman says there's this nation and they're scattered, but he says still they're not that scattered at this point. He says the men of the great assembly and many people had already returned to the land of Israel, and there were many people in Israel living in walled cities, suggests the Ramban. They had already rebuilt cities. They were living in walled cities in Israel. And if that's the case, the decree of Haman felt very different for people in the land of Israel, living in fortified cities already, versus people living outside the land of Israel in unwalled cities, or even walled cities outside, but certainly unwalled cities. And and so the danger was much greater for those outside the land of Israel. And so when the miracle happens and we defeat our enemies, so in the other provinces, everywhere else, they they go to battle on the 13th and they rest on the 14th and they make it into a day of mishteh v'simcha. And in Shushan also they go to battle and they make the next day a day of joy and celebration. And that was the first year. The first year they're victorious, they celebrate their victory. But what happens after that? What happens after that first year? So here he reads, and if you want to look back at the verses, you can. Back to verse 19, as I pointed out, it says, therefore those in the unwalled cities made the 14th into a day of joy on their own without anybody enacting anything. It was all the people in the unwalled cities, they felt the greatest danger, and therefore they had the greatest appreciation of their salvation. So on their own, they established we're going to keep celebrating this year after year. But that was only the people in the unwalled cities. The people in the walled cities never felt as threatened. In particular, or particularly the ones in walled cities that were Jewish walled cities, like in the land of Israel, and 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 therefore those people in the walled cities never didn't on their own make themselves a holiday. They didn't make a holiday for themselves the next year, and that's why it only says in verse 19 that those in the unwalled cities made the 14th into a holiday. Now, after that, however, the he says the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, like opened the eyes of the sages, and they found a source for the idea that they should make a holiday. Now, the Ramban seems to be referring to a Gemara that talks about that they found a source for canonizing the book of Esther as part of Tanakh. And the Ran wonders, what does the Ramban mean that they found a source for making Purim into a holiday? That's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says they found a source for making Esther part of Tanakh. But the Ramban's words are, the sages found a source for making Purim into a holiday, and and they made it into a holiday for everybody, and because really everybody was in danger, not just those in the unwalled cities, and it was just maybe a little bit different, but everybody was in danger. But because the danger was different, and because those in the unwalled cities had made their own holiday already, when the sages enacted Purim, they made different days for different people. Those who had the greatest danger, those in the unwalled cities were in the most danger. They had anyways already established the 14th as a holiday, so the sages said, you're going to celebrate on the 14th. But to distinguish maybe the level of danger and the fact that the people living in walled cities had not accepted a day on their own because they hadn't felt as much danger and they hadn't felt the need to establish their own holiday. Therefore, they established that those in the walled cities would celebrate on a different day on the 15th, and that's why it says in the verse. In verse 23 and 24, it says the Jews took upon themselves what they had commenced to do. They had already started doing this on their own. They had already commenced on their own. Those in the unwalled cities, they already started celebrating the 14th of Adar on their own. And only later the sages said, we're going to make this official. This is going to be a rabbinically ordained holiday, and not just on the 14th, but also on the 15th. Why? As it says in verse 24, for Haman the son of Hamdasa, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had devised to destroy the Jews. Torer kol hayudim. It wasn't just those who were in unwalled cities who were threatened, but even those in walled cities, even if they felt protected, no, they were also in danger, and therefore the holiday is going to be for everybody. And but it's going to be on separate days, and to distinguish that difference, though, in terms of the significance, it's definitely more significant for the unwalled cities than for the walled cities, and therefore the unwalled cities celebrate first on the 14th, the day that they are anyways taking upon themselves, and the walled cities celebrate on the 15th, the day which was similar to Shushan, but it's not about Shushan according to the Ramban. It's just that it should be a different day. It should be a different day because it wasn't the same level of danger, and therefore we want to demarcate the difference between those that are in the unwalled cities and those that are in the walled cities. And and then in terms of so that's why the walled cities have a different day. Now, in terms of why we go back to Yoshua ben Nun, why do we define it? Not we should define it again by those days, not by the days of Yoshua ben Nun. So again, he goes back to that same Yerushalmi, the same Yerushalmi that says that um, well, his language is the main miracle actually was for the people of Eretz Yisrael, because that's where the most Jews were at this point. So, although they were, again, under Persian rule, so they were still under the threat. But according to the Ramban, again, this is debated. The Ran debates him on this, but the Ramban says the majority of Jews were already living in Eretz Yisrael at this point, which means that the majority of the threat was to Jews of the land of Israel. That's who was under the most threat. And therefore, the greatest celebration should be in the land of Israel. Um, and But again, like the Yerushalmi says, many of the cities were not yet rebuilt. Many of the cities of Eretz Yisrael were not yet rebuilt. So there's this back and forth. He's saying they were secure in Eretz Yisrael, but they weren't. This is where it gets a little. This is where the Ran challenges him again. But so he argues that there were those who were protected, but also maybe the main cities, the cities of Yerushalayim, they were not rebuilt yet, and therefore it would be a dishonor to the land of Israel to only establish, to only view walled cities as those that were walled since in those days, in the days of Achashverosh, and therefore in order to give honor to the land of Israel, they based it on going back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun. So okay, so what we see, it's a bit of a technical class, but I think it it's it fits in. We're living with light. We have to understand what the idea behind 2 days of Purim is, and why Yerushalayim is celebrating Purim today on Shushan Purim. What does it have to do with Shushan? So we have two basic approaches. One, the beginning, the starting point is why are walled cities different than unwalled cities, and according to the Ran, it's simply because Shushan was walled, and in order to amplify and accentuate the miracle that happened in Shushan, if only Shushan celebrated on the 15th, then it wouldn't be so noticeable. So we have all walled cities celebrate the same as Shushan, and so that's why walled cities, according to the Ran, also celebrate on the 15th. According to the Ramban, walled cities also celebrate on the 15th because it was a different miracle for walled cities. They were, at least the walled cities that were inhabited by just Jews, they were more protected. They felt more protected. They weren't as in danger, although they were in danger still, so they still celebrate, but it's a different level, so it's a different day. You have the 14th, we're in the most danger. They, on their own, established a day of celebration on the 14th. For the unwalled cities, the walled cities, though, celebrate on the 15th, a separate day. That's what the Ramban says. It should be a different day because it wasn't the same level of danger. In terms of why we go back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun, so the first point is based on the Yerushalmi, that if we would base it on the days of Achashverosh, then it's kind of insulting to the land of Israel because much of the land of Israel was desolate, was destroyed, was unwalled, like the city of Yerushalayim was destroyed at that point. So it would be dishonorable to the land of Israel, and therefore we want to turn back the clock and base what the definition of a walled city based on when the land of Israel was in its prime, was standing, was inhabited. And in terms of why we don't just go back, to before the destruction, why do we go all the way back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun? So that, first of all, the Gemara has a drasha, has a gzera shava to derive it from a verse in the Torah. But in terms of the idea behind it, we mentioned the idea of Rabbi Vadim Bartanura that, well, we want to tie it to Yoshua because Yoshua was the one who began the fight with Amalek, and the first time in the desert. And so this day, which celebrates defeating Amalek, we, when it comes to the walled cities that we're turning back the clock and basing on earlier generations, we're going to turn it all the way back to the days of Yoshua ben Nun in order to be able to kind of mention the name of Yoshua ben Nun as the one who began the battle against Amalek. So there we have the idea behind 2 days of Purim, Shushan Purim, and the Purim that they celebrate today on the 15th of Adar in Yerushalayim. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.